Today, we're diving into a topic that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's one of the most important conversations I ever have in my office. Women take you for granted when you cannot walk away. And before we get into it, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here because this is one of those lessons that can shift the entire direction of a man's emotional life. Now let's talk about what this really means. In every relationship, there's a subtle balance of power, attention, and emotional investment. When that balance tilts too far in one direction, something starts to happen quietly and gradually. Someone begins to feel entitled, and someone else begins to feel invisible. I've seen this dynamic unfold countless times in long-term couples, new relationships, even situationships. And the pattern is almost always the same. The moment one person loses the ability or the willingness to walk away, the entire relationship shifts. I've sat across from men who gave everything: affection, reassurance, stability, emotional labor, and in their minds, they believed that giving more would create more appreciation. But what they discovered, painfully, is that when you give without boundaries, when you stay no matter how poorly you're treated, the other person stops valuing what you offer. Not because they're cruel or malicious, but because human nature responds to what feels secure, predictable, and guaranteed. The most controversial truth here is simple. When someone knows you won't walk away, even if they stop showing up for you, even if they stop treating you with care, they begin to take you for granted almost automatically. I've seen it happen subtly. Small, dismissive comments, less effort, assumptions that you'll always be there. And when I gently point it out to clients, the realization hits hard. This video isn't about blaming women. It's about understanding the psychology of relationships and reclaiming your self-respect. And today, I want to guide you through the signs, the reasons, and the changes you must make. Not to create fear, but to create balance. Let's get started. 1. When certainty replaces appreciation. There's a moment in almost every relationship I've observed, whether in couples therapy or individual sessions, when appreciation quietly slips out the back door and certainty takes its place. It doesn't happen suddenly. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, until one day a man sits across from me, wondering how the woman who once admired everything he brought into the relationship now barely notices the effort he's pouring in. And the hardest part for him to accept is that her shift didn't begin when he made a mistake. It began when he became predictable, permanently available, and emotionally dependent on her approval. What I've learned over the years is that appreciation thrives in environments where effort feels meaningful. But the moment your presence feels guaranteed, your effort stops being seen as effort and starts being seen as a default setting. I remember many sessions where I couldn't use names, of course, but I watched the same pattern unfold. A man giving more, showing up more, adjusting more, believing that his consistency would deepen the bond. Instead, what deepened was the woman's sense that he'd never leave, no matter how far the connection drifted from mutual respect. This isn't about villainizing women, it's about recognizing a human pattern. When people become certain of you, your forgiveness, your tolerance, your availability, they stop questioning whether they're giving enough in return. They don't wake up and decide to take you for granted. They simply adapt to the level of assurance you've given them. And once they believe they could never lose you, the urge to nurture the relationship weakens. The truth is, uncertainty creates attentiveness. Predictability without boundaries creates complacency. I've seen men ignore this shift because confronting it feels painful. It's easier to believe that if you continue giving, the old dynamic will return, the one filled with appreciation, warmth, and mutual effort. But relationships don't work that way. You can't revive appreciation by offering more. You revive it by resetting the balance. And resetting the balance starts with understanding the value of being able to walk away, not as a threat, but as proof that you honor yourself. When I talk to men about this, I often see a moment of hesitation. They've been taught that unwavering commitment should earn unwavering love. But commitment without boundaries isn't love, it's self-neglect. And when you neglect yourself long enough, the other person begins to follow your lead. If you don't respect your limits, they won't either. If you don't stand up for your emotional needs, they stop recognizing them. If you don't show that your presence is a privilege, it slowly becomes an expectation. Appreciation grows when your value is felt, not assumed. And value is felt most deeply when you have the strength to step back, to say no, to walk away if you must. Ironically, the moment you become less certain, the relationship often becomes more intentional. And that's the balance we're here to rebuild. 2. The silent shift in power. There's a moment in a relationship that almost no one notices as it's happening, yet it's one of the most important turning points a man will ever experience. I call it the silent shift in power. It doesn't come with an argument. It doesn't come with a dramatic breakup. It arrives quietly through small emotional exchanges that feel harmless at first, but over time, those little moments form a pattern that shapes the entire dynamic between you and her. I've watched this unfold in session after session. A man starts out strong, grounded, centered in who he is. He has standards, routines, passions, friendships, goals outside the relationship. There's balance. He gives, she gives. Both contribute. Both feel valued. But slowly, he begins to tie more of his emotional stability to her reactions. Not intentionally, not dramatically. It starts with wanting to make her happy. Then it becomes trying not to upset her. Then it becomes adjusting parts of himself to avoid conflict. And eventually, without realizing it, he stops expressing what he truly thinks because he fears she might pull away. When that happens, the power shifts. Not because she demanded it, not because she set out to control anything. It shifts because he placed the emotional steering wheel in her hands. And once someone realizes they're steering, even subconsciously, they behave differently. They know you won't push back. They know you'll always bend. They know you're emotionally invested in them more than you are in your own boundaries. And even though they may still care about you, something inside them relaxes in the wrong direction. I've had men tell me they don't know what happened. They say she used to respect them, admire them, meet them halfway, but now she seems irritated, distant, or unbothered by their needs. And as gently as I can, I explain that when a man becomes more emotionally dependent on a woman than she is on him, the balance shifts, and so does her behavior. She may not even be aware of the shift, but she feels it. People sense when the other person needs the relationship more than they do. This is where men need the most education, because this pattern is not about manipulation or cruelty, it's psychology. It's human nature. Power in relationships doesn't come from dominance. It comes from emotional independence. When you can hold your own emotional ground, when your happiness isn't entirely tied to her responses, you naturally command respect. Not through fear, but through stability. Men often ask me how to stop this shift once it's begun, and the answer is always the same. You must return to yourself. Reconnect with your sense of self-worth, separate from her approval, rebuild your boundaries, show up as the man you were before fear entered the relationship. When she sees that you're no longer driven by insecurity or desperation, the dynamic begins to rebalance. Respect finds its way back. Because the truth is, power isn't taken, it's surrendered, and it can be reclaimed the moment you choose yourself again. 3. How overinvestment breeds entitlement. There's a pattern I've seen so many times in my therapy office that I could almost predict it before the words leave a man's mouth. It usually starts with a sentence like, "But I did everything for her," and he means it. He loved hard. He showed up. He sacrificed. He tried to be the steady foundation, the place she could always land. He believed that giving more would create more connection. But instead, the opposite happened. She started giving less. What many men don't realize is that overinvestment doesn't create closeness. It often creates entitlement, not because the woman is unkind and not because she set out to take advantage of him. It happens because when one person pours overwhelmingly into the relationship while the other doesn't have to, the emotional balance becomes distorted. The more effort you offer without boundaries, the less valuable that effort feels. I've seen this unfold with men who assume that being endlessly loyal and endlessly forgiving would strengthen the relationship. They believed that love meant saying yes every time, accommodating every shift in mood, and showing up even when they were exhausted or emotionally drained. But what they didn't realize is that when everything you do is guaranteed, the other person stops seeing it as devotion and starts seeing it as a standard they don't have to contribute to. That's how entitlement begins. I've watched women, again, not maliciously, start expecting things they once appreciated. The thoughtful gestures he used to do out of love, they become routine. The emotional support he offered, it becomes something she assumes will always be there, even if she doesn't reciprocate. And the more he gives, hoping it will bring things back to how they used to be, the more she quietly adapts to the dynamic where he needs her more than she needs him. It's a cycle that drains a man's confidence without him even noticing. He starts shrinking himself. He becomes afraid to say no, afraid to ask for anything, afraid to hold her accountable. And that's when I have to gently remind him, love without boundaries isn't love, it's self-erasure. And when you erase yourself, the other person naturally stops recognizing your value. The real engaging lesson here, the truth men rarely hear, is that relationships thrive when both people feel responsible for the emotional health of the connection. But when you overinvest, you remove her responsibility. You do both sides of the work. You carry both emotional loads. And while it seems noble, it actually creates emotional laziness on her side and exhaustion on yours. The solution isn't to give less love. It's to give love with boundaries, to show up without sacrificing your voice, to support without abandoning your own needs. When you restore balance, you restore mutual effort. And once mutual effort returns, appreciation returns with it. Overinvestment doesn't make her stay. Balance does, respect does, boundaries do, and the moment you reclaim those, the entire energy of the relationship shifts back toward equality. 4. Why emotional boundaries? Protect respect. In therapy, I often hear men describe a relationship that changed slowly, almost secretly, until they barely recognize themselves in it. One man once told me, without mentioning details that would break confidentiality, that he felt like he had slid out of his own life. He wasn't being dramatic. He was describing what happens when emotional boundaries disappear. In the beginning of his relationship, things felt balanced. He had his routines, his friendships, his goals. She had hers. They met in the middle and both brought value to the connection. But over time, he began adjusting himself to hold the relationship together. At first, it was small compromises. Then it became bigger ones. Eventually, his emotional needs didn't feel like needs anymore. They felt like inconveniences he didn't want to mention. And that's the exact moment boundaries start to erode. Without emotional boundaries, you don't just lose your voice. You lose the respect that comes with having one. When he told me he stopped saying how he felt because he didn't want to upset her, or that he avoided bringing up issues to keep the peace, it became clear that he had started protecting her comfort at the expense of his own well-being. And as a result, she began responding differently, not because she was destructive or uncaring, but because people naturally treat you according to the standards you reinforce. Emotional boundaries are not walls. They're guidelines for how you should be treated. When you don't communicate them, people don't know where the line is. And if you never enforce them, the line keeps moving until it disappears completely. That's exactly what happened with him. His silence became the path of least resistance, and the relationship reshaped itself around that silence. The impact was subtle at first. She became less mindful of his feelings. She started assuming he'd always agree, always accommodate, always follow along. And because he never challenged these shifts, she interpreted his lack of boundaries as acceptance. But inside he felt smaller, less seen, less valued. That's what happens when emotional boundaries dissolve. You create a relationship where your needs become optional. I told him something I've told many men over the years, that boundaries don't push people away. They teach people how to love you. They protect your dignity, your sanity, and your place in the relationship. When you express your limits respectfully and consistently, you create emotional structure. Structure builds trust, and trust restores balance. Eventually, he began speaking up again, gently but firmly. He stopped apologizing for having needs. He stopped assuming silence would solve everything. And something interesting happened. Her respect for him returned, not because he became aggressive or distant, but because he became whole again. He showed her that his emotional life mattered too. Boundaries aren't about creating distance. They're about creating mutual respect. And without respect, even the strongest relationship starts to fall apart. 5. When your absence speaks louder than your effort. There's a story I often think about when I explain this lesson to men. A man once sat across from me and said, "I tried everything. Nothing worked." He wasn't exaggerating. He had been patient, supportive, generous, and emotionally available at every turn. He believed that if he poured enough effort into the relationship, eventually she would meet him halfway again. But instead, the more he tried, the less she responded. And the day things finally shifted wasn't a day he tried harder. It was a day he pulled back for the first time. This man, like many I've worked with, believed effort was the key to connection. But in his case, his effort had become background noise. He was always available, always present, always ready to fix things. And because he never took a step back, she never had to take a step forward. She became accustomed to his presence, his attention, and his reassurance. It wasn't intentional on her part. It was human nature adjusting to what felt permanently guaranteed. He told me there was a night when he didn't respond immediately to her messages because he was exhausted, emotionally drained. For the first time in a long time, he chose to rest. And that's when she reached out differently, more carefully, more attentively, almost surprised by his silence. She asked if he was okay. She checked in with a tone she hadn't used in months. For the first time in that relationship, his absence said something his words never could. The truth I explained to him is simple. Consistent effort is meaningful only when paired with space for the other person to contribute. When you're always present, always available, your presence loses its weight. But when you give yourself room to breathe, when you take a step back for your own well-being, you create contrast. And contrast reminds the other person that your energy, your time, and your emotional availability are not unlimited resources. In his case, that small pause exposed a deeper imbalance. He had been carrying most of the emotional work. He was showing up even on days he had nothing left to give. And because he never gave her the opportunity to show up for him, she never realized how little she was contributing. When he finally stopped overfunctioning, she finally saw how much he had been doing. I want men to understand this. Sometimes your absence highlights your value more than your presence does. Not because you're playing games or punishing someone, but because stepping back allows reality to recalibrate. It creates space for her to reflect, to reassess, and to recognize what she may have taken for granted. And in that recalibration, respect often returns, appreciation returns, effort returns. This man didn't save his relationship by doing more. He saved it by finally doing less, by allowing himself to matter. And once he did, the entire dynamic changed, not through force, but through balance. 6. Rebuilding balance. Through self-priority. 500 words. One of the most powerful shifts I've witnessed in men, both inside and outside the therapy room, happens the moment they rediscover themselves. It's almost like watching someone wake up after years of moving through life on autopilot. And this awakening usually begins when a man realizes he's been giving so much of himself to keep the relationship alive that he's forgotten the parts of his life that once made him feel whole. Rebuilding balance starts with something most men abandon too easily: self-priority. This isn't selfishness. This isn't neglect. This is the foundation of emotional stability. There was a period in my career where I saw the same scenario repeat with different men. They came in confused, exhausted, and feeling unappreciated. They thought the solution was to fix things with her, say the right words, offer more reassurance, do all the emotional heavy lifting. And each time I would gently guide them back to one question: when was the last time you prioritized yourself? The room always fell quiet after that, because somewhere along the line, they'd stopped doing the things that once fueled them. They stopped going to the gym consistently. They stopped seeing their friends. They stopped pursuing hobbies, goals, routines, and dreams that once defined their identity. Their entire emotional world started revolving around how the relationship felt on any given day. And when you lose yourself like that, you lose the balance that keeps a relationship healthy. Rebuilding that balance doesn't start with trying to change her behavior. It starts with changing your own. I have watched men gradually reintroduce self-priority into their lives, and the transformation is incredible. They start by doing small things, waking up earlier to focus on their own goals, spending time with the people who make them feel alive, pushing forward in their career, or simply taking a day to reset mentally. At first, it feels unfamiliar, sometimes even guilty, but then something shifts. They feel grounded again. What's fascinating is how often their partner responds to this shift without needing any conversation about it. When a man reconnects with his own purpose, his energy changes, he becomes more confident, more centered, less reactive, and less emotionally dependent on her mood. He communicates differently, he moves differently, he stops chasing validation because he's validating himself through his own actions and discipline, and that's when balance naturally returns. She begins to see him again, not as the guy who's always available, always adjusting, always waiting for her emotional cues, but as the man he was when she first felt drawn to him, someone driven, someone grounded, someone who has a life, not just a relationship. Men often underestimate how deeply self-priority affects relational dynamics. When you prioritize yourself, you show that your well-being matters. You show that your values, goals, and time are important. And when you live like that, people, partners included, respond with more respect. Rebuilding balance begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself. When you return to your own center, the relationship recalibrates around that strength. 7. Walking away as a form of self-respect. There's a conversation I've had with men more times than I can count, and it often happens at a point when they're emotionally drained, unsure of what else to try. They usually ask something like, "Does walking away mean I failed?" And every time I remind them of a truth that's uncomfortable but deeply necessary. Walking away isn't about giving up on the relationship, it's about refusing to give up on yourself. The idea of walking away carries weight for men because many of you were raised to believe endurance is strength. You were taught that staying no matter what is proof of loyalty. But loyalty without self-respect isn't loyalty. It's self-abandonment. And the moment you abandon yourself, the relationship begins to reshape itself around that weakness. I once spoke with a man who told me he stayed in a relationship long after he should have stepped back. Not because he was happy, not because things were improving, but because he believed walking away would make him look like the bad guy. He tolerated disrespect, inconsistency, emotional distance, and a lack of effort because he feared the consequences of leaving more than he feared losing himself. He didn't realize that his inability to walk away was silently teaching her that his boundaries were flexible and his standards were negotiable. When a woman, or anyone for that matter, realizes you can't walk away, the entire emotional dynamic shifts. Your needs become suggestions instead of requirements. Your feelings become whispers instead of boundaries. And your presence becomes something she expects, not something she cherishes. But the moment you show that you are willing to walk away, not out of anger, not out of manipulation, but from a place of self-respect, everything changes. Walking away isn't about making her chase you. It's about reminding yourself that your emotional health matters. It's about recognizing when the relationship is no longer balanced, nurturing, or fair. And most importantly, it's about refusing to stay somewhere that's shrinking you. What surprises many men is how powerful this shift becomes. The moment you step back, calmly, clearly, and without hostility, people start to see the version of you that they forgot existed. Your value becomes visible again because you're valuing yourself. Your absence becomes meaningful because your presence finally has weight again. I've watched men walk away not to punish anyone, but to heal. And in many cases, that distance brought clarity, not just for them, but for the woman too. Sometimes she steps up, realizing what she took for granted. Sometimes she doesn't. But either way, the man walks forward with a stronger understanding of his worth. Walking away is not a threat. It's a boundary, a declaration that you refuse to stay anywhere you're no longer respected, appreciated, or emotionally safe. And when a man learns to walk away with dignity, he discovers something profound. Losing someone will never hurt more than losing himself. At the end of the day, this entire conversation comes down to one truth. A relationship can only stay healthy when both people show up with respect, effort, and emotional responsibility. When you lose your ability to walk away, you lose leverage, balance, and eventually your sense of self. But when you reclaim your boundaries, prioritize your own well-being, and stay grounded in who you are, everything shifts. You stop chasing, you stop shrinking, and you start leading your life again. Walking away isn't about ending love. It's about protecting the part of you that makes love possible in the first place.